welcome back to Talking Mental Health. I'm so glad you're here because this is the first episode of season 2. So I'm going to give you a little quick rundown on what season 2 looks like because we've made some changes and you're going to see some different faces. So for season 1, I sat down with mental health professionals and we talked all things mental health and wellness and related it back to college-age young adults. We talked about resources available for them as well as things that might be lacking for them. And we almost always connected it to peers in some way because those are our biggest support systems in college. So for season 2, we're going to flip it a little bit. We are going to go back and watch each episode, but this time, as we react to it, we're going to bring in a college student. So the college student's going to watch the episode. They're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about things that resonated with them, things they knew about the subjects, things they wish they knew about the subjects. Have they seen these topics, these issues? Have they experienced them? How could we better prepare them? How could they be better prepared to support their peers? All the things. So we're getting their thoughts, their views, their opinions on these topics, which I think is going to be such an important addition. So each episode of season 1 is part 1, and each episode of season 2 will be part 2. So today's episode, we're going to go back and watch episode 1 of season 1 titled Anxiety and Depression. So for this episode, I sat down with Ne'Shaun Borden, who is a licensed mental health counselor in Florida, as well as an assistant professor in the clinical mental health counseling program at Jacksonville University. So today I have with me one of our new Studio Wesley interns, Tess, and I'm going to bring her on screen and let her give just like a quick introduction of who she is.
Hi, my name is Tess Landreth. I am a junior majoring in business management at the University of Florida. So I'm up here in Gainesville. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have you here. So one of the new things in Studio Wesley right now is we have a pilot intern program going. So you're going to see some new faces of our interns as well as some new faces on our team throughout this whole season. So Tess is our lucky winner because she gets to do this episode of Talking Mental Health. So we've both watched the video. We've both gathered our thoughts, and we've prepared some questions for each other, stumbling through my words a little bit, but I think it's just because of how excited I am to be here and to be sitting here with Tess. So if you're ready, Tess, I think we'll just go ahead and go in and start talking about some of these things.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I would love to know. So like I said, topic of this one is anxiety and depression. So I would like to take back this perspective of say you haven't watched this episode before. I would love to know what your thoughts are, what you knew about these topics beforehand.
Yeah. I think anxiety and depression are really big words for college-age young adults. We hear them a lot. I think a lot of people relate to them and have felt them before. So for me personally, I was diagnosed with OCD when I was 10. So I've had a long journey of kind of navigating mental health and mental disorders and treatment and all of these things. And so I have a lot of background or just experience dealing with these, but I've also seen it from the peer perspective of what does it look like when I have a friend going through it and how does their experience look different than mine. So I do think these are probably the most common things that I've seen in my friends and the people around me. And I think some of that just stems from we're really busy and it's hard to not be busy in college and to have a million things going on. And everyone is at least a little bit concerned about their grades and about their social life. And so all of those things tie together. I think it's really easy to feel anxious about what's going on.
Yeah, and I just like to name something that Ne'Shaun said in this episode as she mentioned that now more than ever, we're seeing anxiety and depression in college-age young adults, ever in history. And so I think when she said that, it kind of sat with me for a second where I was like, that's big. And she named too that it could be better measurements, more people speaking up, but it also could be all of these things we have going on in today's society. We just lived through a global pandemic. So there are so many things happening right now that could be impacting that as far as why we're seeing these larger numbers. So
yeah. And her talk about social media too, I think is a big part of it also. Both from seeing what other people are doing and comparing yourself to what they're posting on social media, but also in a good way, there's been more conversation about it. But at the same time, that conversation isn't always accurate and it kind of gets blown out of proportion. And so it's definitely a double-edged sword.
Yeah. And I definitely, because I remember this conversation, that part of the conversation from the first time I sat down with her too. And as rewatching it, to prepare for this, but I remember that because it piqued my interest when she said it. Because, we do see all these sides of mentally ill TikTok, or like just things like this, or people, because people have that, you're on Taylor Swift talk, you're on mentally ill talk,
Yeah.
you're on, and I think there's this fine line between like, taking down some of that stigma, talking about mental health and being like, it's okay to mention these in these spaces, but also like trying not to glamorize it in the same time.
Yeah.
And so I think that's super important. So like we're seeing it everywhere, but finding that line of like, these are good resources on social media where we're sharing, or making people not feel alone, but like also where's that line of like, let's not make it seem like it's a good thing.
I
And
agree
so
100%. And
yeah.
that's something that I see a lot in my friends sometimes is
Mm-hmm.
they'll make like little jokes, and it's almost always just a way to cover up an insecurity, because it's like if you're
Mm-hmm.
making fun of yourself, then other people can't make fun of you for the same thing. Which is
Yeah.
just not a healthy way to deal with it. But yeah, I think that happens on and off social media, just the tendency to like make a
Mm-hmm.
joke about it. But it's still good that we're talking about it, but I feel like it also can then detract from it because we're talking about it in a less than serious light.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm curious, and then sometimes it might be hard to narrow this down. I know I have like a million notes on here, but when you watched this video, was there anything in it, and you can name one thing, multiple, that just really resonated with you? And it could be it resonated with you because maybe you've experienced, or it just resonated with you because she said it and you were like, wow, that's so good. That's so important. Like we need to rename that or name it
Yeah.
again. So I'm just curious.
There were a couple things. One that really stuck out to me was when you were talking to her about balance, and she was saying that balance is one of the best coping mechanisms for
Mm-hmm.
anxiety and depression. And I completely agree. I think it's definitely the best way to approach it. I think it can help us see what's causing it. Like when you take a step
Mm-hmm.
back and look at your life and notice where things are out of balance, like maybe I'm spending too much time at work and not enough time at school. And so then balancing that out will help me feel a little bit better. But it can also just be so hard because we have so many things on our plates. I was talking with someone earlier this week, and I used the metaphor of it feels like I'm juggling or like I'm spinning so many plates, and at some point something is going to drop.
Mm-hmm.
And the person I was talking to kind of took that metaphor a step further, and it was like, well, what if one of the plates is plastic and it's not going to break when you drop it? You just pick it back up and keep going, but you won't know until you
Mm-hmm.
do drop the plate. So I think tying that back to the balance is like it just made that going to rephrase that between my conversation from earlier this week and then hearing Ne'Shaun talk about balance. I feel like those two ideas together are really important because
Mm-hmm.
it's not just like noticing where things are out of balance, but just letting yourself kind of drop that and figure things out and take things one day at a time, one step at a time. Um, I know that's been really useful for me, at least when I'm feeling overwhelmed and really anxious about everything going on in my life. Just narrowing it down, letting things happen as they will. You can't control everything. And I feel like that's one of the hardest things to overcome when you're feeling anxious.
Yeah, yeah, and I loved that whole section on coping skills, because one, she named a few different options. Because for some people, they might see that phrase of like, "Well, you need to find a better balance," and they're like, "That is not what I need you to tell me right now. That
Right.
is exactly what's going to make me spiral further than I am because I have too much on my plate." But she gave a couple of options, and then she kind of talked about like understanding the why behind it. Like, why are we taking deep breaths?
Mm-hmm.
Why are we going for a walk? Why are we looking at our schedule to try to balance it out more? And I really appreciate that because I think sometimes just being told you should do this thing, that we're like,
But
I,
why?
I don't I don't know why I'm doing this, and I don't
Yeah.
have time to figure out why on my own, and so I'm just gonna keep going where I am. And it takes away some of that like fear of the unknown, because she was like, this is important. This is, you need to have things in place so that way when you are feeling anxious and when you are feeling depressed, you don't continue to spiral further down.
Right. And I know
um,
that balance is really helpful for me,
mm-hmm,
but I only came to find that out by trying other things as well. So,
mm-hmm,
like, therapy is really helpful for me, but then there are other seasons where it's just not super helpful. Like, it's not the best thing for it. And I instead need to just find the time to, like, balance things out. And so I think it's important to note that like it's different for everybody, but it can also be different in different times of your own life. And you may have to try a couple different coping strategies to really figure out what works for you. And maybe it'll work for a little while and then it'll change. So just being flexible and not getting discouraged when something doesn't work out.
Gosh, I love what you just said, though, about different times of your lives. Because I think sometimes we go to college and so much is changing. So many things. And we have an episode about this later in the season about first-time college students. But so many things change, including a lot of like yourself. You're going through all these changes. You're learning all these new things. Depending on, how you grew up or how you were raised, you might be changing very big parts of who you are. And so what worked freshman year might not be what works senior year, but sometimes I think we beat ourselves up about that. We're like, man, you know what? I used to be able to go for a walk and it cleared my head and I could focus afterwards. Why isn't that working anymore? What's wrong with me? Because it's not working. So I just love that you named that, like, it could change and we have to have like, be prepared for it to change and have other options to do in times of need. I just want to.
For sure. I mean, even right now, like I am kind of going through this period where at the end of last year, it was really important for me to work out and move my body and exercise. And if I didn't, then I just felt really disorganized and I couldn't focus. But then lately, I'll like go take a yoga class and I'll spend the entire class just thinking about what else I need to be doing that day and how else I could be using that time. And so it's almost been kind of counterproductive. And usually I've found that like if I take a step back, don't do that for a little while, spend that time working on homework or doing things like that, then that's what I needed in that time. And then I'll start taking classes again and be like, this is great. This is what I need right now. So just being flexible. And I do think it can be hard to kind of give yourself grace with that. Like you were saying, like just knowing that it's okay, that things change, that you don't need to beat yourself up about it.
Yeah. And on that note too, I'm curious, she said one more thing that I just remembered from her coping skills section of that episode is that one of the things she said is coping skills may not work the first time. And I'm wondering if you have experience with that. If like there were certain things that you tried once and you're like, man, this is not for me, but then you tried it again or maybe a few more times and it started to kind of like settle a little bit. So I'm just curious.
Yeah. For me, that was really my experience with therapy. I was in therapy when I was younger. That's actually where I was diagnosed with OCD. But as I got older, I would kind of do it and then I would stop doing it for a little while and then I would do it. And I found that not only is it sometimes not the right thing for me, but also sometimes you have to find the right person. Like you have to try a couple to really find someone that you resonate with and that really understands you. And the person that I'm working with right now at the Counseling and Wellness Center at UF has been amazing. And we just have a lot in common. And it just feels a lot more comfortable talking with her. And I feel more like settled and grounded at the end of a session than I have with some of my past counselors in the past. So I think that's another aspect of it too, is like you said, you have to kind of try things more than once. It might not work the first time. Sometimes you just have to shift things around. Like it may not, if you need to move your body, maybe it's not going to the gym and lifting weights. It's taking a yoga class. It's going for a walk. So just trying different things and don't letting, oh my gosh, and not letting yourself get discouraged.
You're good. Yeah. And I want to shift a little bit too, because you're mentioning therapy. And so one of the things we learned from this episode is I tended to ask the professionals, what are common treatments? So if you're someone who is experiencing anxiety and depression, whether it's diagnosed, whether you're on the path of like, I think I need to see a doctor because there is something here, or a friend sees it and they're like, these aren't typical daily actions or daily, things people deal with daily. One of the things she said is typical treatment for anxiety and depression is starting with talk therapy, some sort of cognitive behavioral therapy, and then medication, depending on what works best for you. So I want to name that too. You brought up therapy, that, these are some of the common treatments that we see for anxiety and depression.
For sure. Yeah. And I feel really fortunate that I've had the experience I have in dealing with my own mental health. This summer, I was able to actually get in to see a psychiatrist here at UF. We have a couple on campus in our student healthcare center. And so I was able to start medication is part of my treatment plan. And so that in conjunction with therapy has been really interesting. And it's like we've talked about already, it's not like a one size fits all. We've like adjusted the dosage, we've adjusted all these different things when I take it. And so it's just kind of you keep checking in with it, seeing how it's working. But yeah, I feel really fortunate that my campus has that option available to me.
Yeah. And on that note too, I mean, a lot of campuses have counseling centers. And if they don't have counseling centers, they have like some sort of outreach.
Right.
Like just in general, you know, Ne'Shaun talks in this episode that she works at the counseling center for Jacksonville University. And so a lot of them have it. It's just about knowing about them, finding those resources, knowing those resources. And one of the things we talk about a lot is peer support. And a big part of being a peer supporter might be knowing where those resources are, because say you have a friend who just seems not like themselves, you know, and it's been going on a while and maybe they aren't noticing, or maybe they're just in a spot where they're not going to do anything about it. You knowing those resources are just as helpful. So knowing the counseling center exists, taking a walk with them to the counseling center if they're afraid to go on their own, kind of thing. So I love that you mentioned that too, because I think I say it in almost every episode that those exist and they're there for you, especially because, you know, some of the things that like Ne'Shaun mentioned in this video is, well, first, just I loved her definitions of these, you know. So anxiety is typically about an imminent threat or danger. And the way she said that, I was like, it puts words to things that people are feeling that you might not understand if you're not in that position. And she said it's as if your body or mind is working as if harm or danger is coming your way in that moment. And that's like your body's reaction to it. And then she also goes on to talk about depression, like, you know, feeling sad is normal, but it becomes depression when it's prolonged or if it messes with your ability to function your everyday life.
Yeah.
And so taking like those definitions and then thinking about other things she said, like, she said that some studies show that 60% of college-age young adults deal with anxiety and depression. And it has that lumped together because they're also comorbid mental illnesses, which means comorbid is just you have multiple mental illnesses that kind of they go together or they're present together or they're typical to be found together. And so I just think it's interesting, like knowing what they are, knowing those statistics, and just naming that like there are resources in place, but how do we find them? I think is where we get stuck.
Yeah. And I think we already kind of talked about, you know, social media and talking about these things online and how that can open up the space, but sometimes it also leads to this like just oversupply of information, and you're like, how do I take all of this into account and figure out, you know, how I'm feeling, like what if it applies to me? And the bit about comorbidity also stood out to me because I have that, like the way that my OCD presents itself isn't through physical compulsions, but it's through obsessive thoughts, which then can kind of relate into anxiety, because if I'm feeling anxious about it, that's where those thoughts start.
Yeah.
And then the longer I obsess over those thoughts, then potentially depression can start to seep in. And so one thing I've learned about it on like my own journey and my own research, and she kind of touched on this too, is that I think it often gets overlooked that these are parts of our brain. Like this is how our brain works. And so it's not just, you know, something that you like catch like the flu. It's something that's just part of you and your anatomy, and learning to overcome it isn't just a one-time like fix. It's really learning how to cope with it, and that's going to be a longer term process than just like taking some NyQuil, getting rid of a cold. Like it's not that sort of thing.
Yeah. And I think it's just so important to talk about those things and discuss those things. And I, like I said, I don't think I said this yet. I told you this before we started recording. I appreciate you sharing kind of like those more personal notes too, because I think it gives us those spaces of people who watch this, you know, they know they're not alone because they may be experiencing something similar. So I do appreciate you sharing that with us.
Yeah. And it was hard, I think, to share it. Not right now, but like in the past it has been. And that is one of the beauties of it being talked about more, is that as I've heard more people talking about it, I've been more willing to share about it. And I've gotten, you know, good feedback and supportive comments from friends and family and everything like that. And so I feel like as long as we keep going down this path, the stigma
Yeah.
will just continue to lessen.
Yeah, and I think that's the goal here, right? Because I mean, just like you said, it was scary to talk about before, but the more we talk about it, the more people get comfortable talking about it. I feel like the more people who are going to step up who need help.
For sure.
You know, I think it taking away that stigma might be what gets someone to walk into a therapist's office for the first time. They might not be as ashamed as they might have been feeling because they're like, you know what? My friend the other day mentioned that she sees a therapist. Maybe this actually is okay. And so I'm such a big like proponent of talking about it, say the thing. And obviously there is a comfort level. But
Right.
I'm so big on it. Like the more we share about this kind of stuff, the more people we may be helping in the process, I guess is where I'm going with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like you mentioned earlier, Ne'Shaun, naming all of those coping mechanisms is really
Yeah.
important too, because I do think, as far as mental health goes, people often see it as like you can go to therapy, you can get on a medication for it, and they're like two very separate streets, and that's all that exists. But there are all of these other things, like there's even different types of therapy, you know, there's group therapy, there's individual therapy, medications, there's all of these different ones. It's not one size fits all. Um, but there's also
Mm-hmm.
just like mindfulness, meditation, yoga. There's so many different options that the more we name and the more we kind of publicize as coping mechanisms and as treatments, the more aware people become of them, and then they try them and hopefully find one that works for them.
Yeah. Yeah. I have one more thing I want to name that kind of because we've kind of just navigated into this conversation about things we were hearing and how we relate to them. But like as far as things that resonated with me, there's one big thing that I remembered from the first time I talked to Ne'Shaun. Like this wasn't even like when I was watching it to prepare for this. Is she said because it had so much of like an effect on me that it's just been in here since then.
Mm-hmm.
She said feelings are not facts, but they can feel like it in that moment, and that
I
is
was
just one of the
hoping you were
things
going to
that
bring this up.
yeah, I as soon as I was like, oh, we're doing a part two, we're going to talk about this because it is so good. And I'm curious your thoughts on that just in general.
Yeah, that was also something that I had kind of noted after watching this. And one of the things that really struck with me was I had a counselor pretty early on who one of her techniques for helping me kind of cope was changing the way that I talked to myself about things that I was
Mm,
feeling and experiencing. And so an example of that is like instead of saying I am depressed, saying I'm feeling depressed or I'm feeling this way. And it kind of repaints it from this is who I am. This is what I am.
mm-hmm,
Like you are not a mental disorder. You are not your thoughts. You can feel those things, but that doesn't define you. And
mm-hmm.
so um it's really hard to stray away from that, and it's really easy to just be like, oh, I'm an
Yeah.
anxious mess. Oh, I'm depressed. But when you do reframe it into those, they're just feelings. They will feelings are not feelings are temporary. Feelings are not permanent. It makes it, at least for me, it kind of helps me process them and
Mm-hmm.
recognize that I will get through this. It will be okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love that too because I have heard that like with other things, you know, instead of saying I am this, I have this.
Right.
Um and it seems so simple sometimes when you're like just change a word, but in that moment when you're feeling anxious or you're feeling depressed and like, you know, you feel like there's this catastrophe going on, it might not be so simple to change
Right.
those words. But again, it's just something that the more we talk about, I think the more we can put it into practice. So that's, yeah, thank you for sharing that as well. Uh, I just know that whole like feelings aren't fact thing. I was like, we're going to talk about this for a second. So I'm glad that you were ready
Yeah. And I
for
think
that
it's
one.
also the more we talk about it, we notice that like everyone feels things differently.
Yeah.
Like even for me with OCD, it's sometimes there's a big stigma of people think of OCD as just like, oh, you're really neat. Maybe your files are color coded, something like that. But that's not like what it really is for most people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so talking about what we feel and how we actually behave um, can then turn into having better supported like facts and understandings of these disorders. Um, So that's another like distinction between the whole like facts and feelings. Like you can feel a certain way, but it presents itself differently in everyone. And so the more we
Yeah.
share about those, the better kind of like a general understanding that we get about it.
Yeah, and I love that you bring that up too, because a lot of times when I'm talking about mental health with people, I like to see it trying to figure out the best like metaphor analogy to use here. So um, with autism recently has become autism, not recently, but it's autism spectrum disorder now. And the
Right.
reason it is that way is because there are so many symptoms or presentations of autism, but there's this common phrase saying of like, you meet one person with autism, you met one person with autism, because everybody with autism is different. They have the
Right.
same diagnosis, but they're different. And I like to think about that space or that kind of phrasing in pretty much every mental health diagnosis,
Yeah.
because there's a list of symptoms, there's a list of presentations. 60% of college age young adults is that statistic that Ne'Shaun said, have anxiety and depression, but it's not going to look the same for all of those 60%.
For sure.
And what is anxiety to one person is going to be so different to what it is for that next person. And so I love that you brought that up too, because it's one of my favorite things of like making sure people understand that, because it's hard to understand what's going on in someone's head in general, because we can't really say we understand unless we've been there.
Exactly.
But it's even harder to understand if we're trying to picture it as like, these people should all look exactly the same because they have the same diagnosis.
Right.
So,
Well, and even in my own life, growing up, like when I was diagnosed with OCD at 10, I didn't really know what that meant at all. But as I've gotten older and looked back, I notice like things that are definitely connected to that, like ways that I thought about things or behaved about certain things. And I also realized that it's hard because it's a lot of things that I was celebrated for growing up. So like having good grades, being really studious, doing lots of different activities, working, playing sports, all of these things I was celebrated for. Oh, you're so smart. Oh, you're so talented. You have such good time management skills. But internally, that's not how it felt. Like it didn't feel good. And it definitely, looking back, was not healthy.
yeah.
And so just understanding that it presents itself differently for everyone. And just because maybe on the outside it looked like there's no way she could be struggling with her mental health because she's doing great and she's
Right.
performing at these really high standards. And so just it looks different. It doesn't have to look bad from the outside. You have no idea like what's actually going on in someone's life.
Yeah, and I appreciate you sharing that, just because it is so important to understand that. That bit about, you never have any idea what's really going on.
Yeah.
What is how much they choose to share with you, which is more for some people than others.
Right.
But I still think there's always this spot of like, you'll never know all of what's happening in someone's head at that moment in time.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have one more question for you, but before I ask it, I want to make sure, was there anything else you wanted to talk about or share from like just the video itself before I ask this last question?
I feel like we've talked through a lot. Like every time that I talk about my own like experiences, I feel like I discover new things about myself and like new coping mechanisms to try, and maybe noticing that something isn't working as well as it did before. So no, this conversation's been really great.
Yeah, very cool. So, and I think I think some of the things you've been saying, all of the things you've been saying so far, are going to be so helpful to someone watching this who might be going through something similar, or might be a college age young adult who's interested in mental health and not sure where to start. I think watching something like this and watching, you talk about these things as someone in a similar position is going to be so helpful. So I think my last question for you is, as someone who is on a college campus, I don't know on a daily basis, but just, throughout the week, is there anything that would be helpful? Maybe it's something you did experience, but maybe you didn't experience it right away, or something you experienced that you think everybody should. What's something that could better prepare you or other college age young adults to assist both yourself when it comes to anxiety, depression, or others? So, like education or things like that.
Yeah. I think we've already talked about this a little bit, but first and foremost is just knowing the resources that are available to you. Like I was really fortunate growing up to have insurance that covered counseling, and so my family wasn't having to pay out of pocket for it. But even here at UF, I mean, we have a counseling and wellness center. Our student healthcare center has psychiatry. So there's all of these resources available. But I do think it's also important to note, because especially here at UF, we have 50,000 undergraduate students. There's just not enough resources to go around. And I think that's also true off college campuses. Like just in general, mental health resources are not as available as they should be. So continuing that conversation, advocacy plays a big role in that. But just knowing the resources that are available, knowing how to get them, because I think that's another thing that I didn't know before I even started looking into them this summer. And doing that during the summer with fewer students, it was easier for me to get in. But I've heard stories of people waiting like months to even just have an evaluation with a counselor on campus. So it's good to know that these resources exist, but I think there's also a lot of work that we as a society need to do to like make them more accessible.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I don't think I could have said that any better. Knowing your resources, knowing how to access them, but also as a society working towards making those more easily accessible.
Yeah. And then on the peer support side, I think it brings in peer support as an even bigger role in dealing with these on college campuses. And I do think that our generation especially has done a pretty good job with it. Like I know, for example, our Panhellenic council here, all of our sororities, they started this program a couple years ago called like Sister Support, where basically it's a group of girls from each sorority who are trained in things like mental health first aid, and they host like open office hours and just different activities to support each other. And I'm not in a sorority, so I can't really speak to the effectiveness of it, but I've seen things about it. So even just knowing that those sorts of programs exist, I think is really important. So if there was one thing that like we as individual college students could do, like I could go out and do today, I can't go change how insurance pays for counseling. Like I don't have that power, but I can learn more about all of these things, try to know like facts versus misinformation, just knowing how to help someone deal with those, both whether it's me, whether it's someone else, knowing all of those, or not all, but just being aware of what mental health first aid is, how do you approach someone who's dealing with different things. Just the more you know, the better you are at dealing with it, the more helpful you can be to someone around you.
Yeah. Gosh, I loved all of that. I am so thankful, Tess, that you joined us on this episode, especially because you're the first one on here with me, first brand new season. So you didn't even get like an example of what this was going to look like. So I appreciate you being here and doing this. All the information you shared, you know, the personal stuff, being a little vulnerable at times, as well as just, I mean, that some of that ending stuff that you were just saying is so important to name. And so I appreciate you putting that out there, putting it into the world more. So yeah, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me and for listening and for carrying on discussion. It's been great.
Yeah. So if you haven't seen part 1, I would encourage you to watch that first to get some of the more background information. We did mention it a lot. We talked about it a lot, but there is so much good information in Ne'Shaun's episode that can be found on YouTube. It can be found on our website, and it'll probably be linked somewhere with this episode. So look for that. I'd watch that first. Give this one a watch. I guess you wouldn't know to watch it first, though, if I'm telling you at the end of this episode, but it's fine.
But yeah,
right, watch it anyway. And we'll be constantly promoting all of this. It'll be up in socials. You'll see reels going up, so check us out on our socials. And we're glad you're here. So thank you.